I think we'd all agree that none of us enjoy the look of this. I don't think any of us human beings would enjoy our backs and our legs and our hind parts subjected to the will of someone saying, "Get on here, boy. Get on here. You better do as I say." Here I am, holding the remnants of this old bullwhip as we look at the whole matter of slavery and answer some questions, or endeavor to answer some questions that I like to cover in this video, such as, is slavery itself immoral? What does the scripture itself say about slavery? What are the differences between the slavery in the Bible and biblical times versus American slavery, or slavery in recent American history, such as the slavery in this country against African Americans? And finally, who is responsible for the atrocity that is American slavery? That is the goal, or those are the goals of this video, and I might actually break them down into several videos. But I want to pick up right away with the first one. Is slavery itself immoral? Oh, is slavery itself immoral? If I was to ask an atheist that question, I would ask them, based upon what do you say that slavery is immoral? Now, since they have no absolute moral authority, because they delete God from the equation, all morality to them, or as far as their worldview is concerned, in reality, is relative. It's what he or she thinks is right and wrong. Right and wrong is in the eyes of the beholder. But some of them try to get slick and say, it's just wrong, it's just wrong. Can't you tell it wrong? It violates empathy. It violates sympathy. How can you enslave another human being and call it right? How can you own another person and call it right? Well, by what are you calling it wrong? By what am I calling it wrong? Yes, by what are you calling it wrong? I just know that it's wrong. I just know. So really what you're saying is, you have no point of reference beyond yourself. But if you insist that you know, you must be saying then that you have no point of reference greater than yourself. You must be suggesting that you came here born with a set of morality. No, I'm not saying that. Well, where did you get your values from, your moral understanding? Well, just like you, I was taught things that were right, things that were wrong, and yeah, Yes, and beyond that, you made observances, you made observations that you thought were right and wrong according to what you were taught, and you decided to keep things that, or call them more what you thought was right, and discard things which you thought were wrong according to your worldview. Now, what makes your worldview greater than any other person that you can impose on your equal man? Because some things are just right and some things are just wrong. Says who? You? See, the problem when you take God out of the equation is that you can't make the argument with any weight or with any authority that all human lives are inherently equal because all of us were made in the image and likeness of God by God. And that is what makes all human lives equal. If one wanted to begin to argue that it's wrong to own another human being, the most sure premise or the most foundational premise to justify the equality of all lives would be based in God Himself and His common creation of all men and all men coming up out of one seed. But when you take God out of the equation, you don't have that, so you can't make that moral argument. Now, if someone wanted to argue that it's wrong in and of itself simply because a human being is a sentient creature, a creature who has senses and faculties, then why is it that we have human beings owning and beating, many of them, their pets? When the pets become unruly or untenable, they own animals and they chastise and punish animals. Am I saying that human beings and animals are of the same value? No, I'm not the one making that claim. But if their argument is that human beings should not be enslaved because they're sentient and at least somewhat autonomous creatures, then one could make that claim about the animals. And then man would have no justification in an atheistic or naturalistic world to own pets. Because I have a God who created man in His image and likeness, and who also gave man dominion over the animals, I have the justification, or at least owning a pet. But you guys can't, the atheistic and antheistic worldview cannot make these claims without borrowing from our foundational principles to hodgepodge, if you will, your moral view. So slavery in and of itself is not immoral. There's nothing wrong in and of itself with owning a sentient being, except in the imagination of men who presume to give themselves, by their own authority, moral weight. So they can basically do whatever or have whatever, rule of law in their own household or how they want to live by there. But no man has the right to impose his morality based out of himself on the world around him. Now, that being said, what is immoral by the word of the God of the Bible, is some of the mistreatments and happenings, the viciousnesses that were involved in slavery, both in biblical times and in American slavery. And I hope to cover those, at least some of them, in the course of this video or short series, whatever it winds up turning out to be. So what does the scripture itself say about slavery? Well, I would say that it falls shy of actually so much endorses the practice, but it acknowledges that it was a practice that was going on at the time that God spoke through Moses about it. God acknowledges his word that it was a practice, an institution that needed restraint, but altogether, in and of itself, God did not find a problem with allowing it to exist on his earth. Now, first I want to look at why, or what the scripture says. If you look at Leviticus 25, I'll pick it up in verse 38. Now, we're already in the midst of a conversation and instructions God has given about slavery and redemption. At large, slavery was an institution where basically you could sell yourself, sort of like a woman would sell her body sexually to make money. People would sell themselves out as servants, not sexually, but sell their bodies for labor, or their families would sell them if they waxed poor and needed the income provided by giving up the family member or giving up themselves to do labor. So we're here in the midst of God talking about rules for Israelites in general, and how their practices of slavery was to be restrained, and what the parameters were, and also talking about redemption, how the Israelites had to let their fellow Israelites go after such and such time, had to release them from their slavery. God commanded release. The question comes in, at least if you're on the anti-theist side, really comes in with the treatment of foreigners, foreign slaves, or slaves brought from other peoples, non-Israelite peoples, by the Israelites. So let me pick it up with the end of the what God said about slavery amongst the Israelites themselves. The scripture says, I am the Lord your God, which brought you forth out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan, and to be your God. And if thy brother that dwelleth by thee is waxen poor, and be sold unto thee, thou shalt not compel him to serve as a bondservant, as a slave, but as a hired servant, and as a sojourner, he shall be with thee, and shall serve thee unto the year of Jubilee. That was the year that they had to release all their fellow Israelites from their slavery. And then shall he depart from thee, both he and his children with him, and shall return unto his own family, unto the possession of his fathers shall he return. For they are my servants, or they are my slaves, which I brought forth out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as bondmen. Thou shalt not rule over him with rigor, but shall fear thy God. So Israelites were not to harshly treat their fellow Israelites at all. They were not to beat them, or do anything that was shame, or bring a fellow Israelite into public disgrace while they were living as servants to them. So, okay, the Israelites, they're already taken care of by God. Now, both thy bondmen and thy bondmaids which thou shalt have shall be of the heathen that are round about you. Of them shall ye buy bondmen and bondmaids. Okay, God says, if you are going to have slaves, and he's not telling them to buy them, but he's saying if you buy them, or acknowledging that they will buy some, he's saying, slaves, permanent slaves, are to be brought from the nations around you, from the non-Israelite people. Now, the fact that they would have to buy them tells very clearly that the other peoples could have said no, that they couldn't just walk in and take slaves willy-nilly, but they would have to buy them or purchase them somehow. And those other nations, or the people of those other nations from whom they would be attempting to buy the slaves, could have refused, or could have right of refusal. And presumably, the Israelite would have to abide by that decision. And here, in this text, given no authority for man stealing. Now, going further down, it says, moreover, the children of the strangers that do sojourn among you, of them shall ye buy, and of their families that are with you, which they begat in your land, and they shall be your possession. And ye shall take them as an inheritance for your children after you inherit them for a possession. They shall be your bondmen forever. But over your brethren, the children of Israel, ye shall not rule over one another with rigor. Now, I know what you're thinking. Probably on the surface, it looks like that God threw the foreigners and their children underneath the bus. If you're thinking that God just didn't care about people unless they were Israelites, that is mistaken. That is very much mistaken. There's some points that I like to interrupt and raise here. First of all, God did not begin the practice of slavery in human history. In fact, the first time in the scripture that is mentioned by Father Noah, who cursed his grandson Canaan, the son of Ham, Ham being Noah's son, who exposed his father Noah's nakedness to his brothers and brought him to shame. So in retaliation, Noah cursed Ham's son and said that he shall be a servant amongst servants to his brethren. Now, that being said, we see later on in Genesis that the practice of slavery, without God ever commanding it into existence on the earth, became practice as Joseph's brothers trying to refrain from killing him in their anger about him prophetically speaking that one day he would become Lord over them or master over them, and they would serve him, although he was the youngest brother. They sold him into slavery to refrain from killing him. That ultimately, through a set of events, wound up ultimately leading to Joseph being sold down into Egypt and ultimately becoming the chief advisor to Pharaoh, and Joseph became the one who helped Pharaoh interpret Pharaoh's dream that a famine was coming for 7 years, and came up with a plan to store up their produce and their harvest for the good years they were having, from the good years they were having against the 7-year famine. And what happened? People when the famine actually came, wound up having to buy food and supplies from Joseph and Pharaoh out of the storage that they had taken up against the famine. And when the people had ran out of money and ran out of livestock to sell, they sold themselves to be servants and bondmen to Joseph and Pharaoh. They sold themselves into slavery for themselves to be receive physical sustenance. So we see that human beings brought on the earth the practice of slavery. Now you might go back and ask, well, nonetheless, God did. You might say, God did throw the foreigner under the bus. You couldn't harm a fellow Israelite if you were an Israelite slave owner. But you could sure harm. You could beat the daughter or the son, the daughter or the son of the foreigner. You could beat them, you could rule over them with rigor, and they were permanent. You could own them permanently. There was no jubilee for them. There was no rights for them. What type of a God would condone that? What type of a God would put that in his law? Now let's get back into the word. Now, the thinking atheist, I'm not sure if I'm quoting this word for word, but he said in his list of Bible atrocities that he had published in a webpage, he said, noted from Exodus 21, I believe it's 20, that it was, according to the God of the Bible, it was wrong to beat a slave to the point of death. However, that if that slave could stand up and walk around in a few days, that the master was not to be punished because the slave was his money, his property. And he puts in parentheses, God is endorsing both slavery and the beating of slaves. Well, let's look at what that text says. If a man smite his servant and his maid with a rod, and he die under his hand, he shall be surely punished. That is, the master shall be surely punished for the death of that slave. Notwithstanding, if he, the slave, continues a day or two, that means he gets back up on his feet in a day or two and is able to go on, he, that now being the master, shall not be punished, for he, the slave, is the master's money. Now, it seems on one hand like if the slave were to die, he gets justice. And I want to go back and make an important note that this is obviously talking about the slave that is a descendant of foreigners and not a fellow Israelite, because remember, as we read before, the Israelites were forbidden from first ever ruling over their fellow Israelite with rigor. They were forbidden from beating them and treating them that way at all. So this would not have even gotten as far amongst two Israelites. So this text is meant for the slave that is of foreign descent. So at first it seems the slave gets justice only in death. that the master who beat him to death would be punished. It says if the slave is able to continue a day or two, the master shall not be punished, for the slave is his money. Now, what does that mean? Well, that in Exodus 20:21 speaks parallel to verses 18 and 19 before it, would speak of two men of equal standing. It says, if men strive together and one smite another with a stone or with his fist, and he die not, but it keepeth his bed, if he rise again and walk abroad upon his staff, then shall he that smote him be quit. Only he shall pay for the loss of his time, and shall cause him to be thoroughly healed. So that's the contrast there. Now, the slave, if a master be the slave, who is he going to pay for the time lost a day or two the slave couldn't work? He was hurting himself and hurting the slave, not just hurting the slave, but in doing so he was hurting himself, because the slave's job is to provide his labor and do his work for him, which he cannot do, so he was hurting his own economics. And of course he would see to the slave's healing, because the slave was a benefit to him as a laborer. But God went on to say in verse 26 and 27 of the same chapter in Exodus, and if a man smite the eye of his servant or the eye of his maid, that it perish, he shall let him go free for his eye's sake. And if he smite out his manservant's tooth or his maidservant's tooth, he shall let him go free for his tooth's sake. Now again, this is clearly talking about slaves that were the descendants of the foreigners, those who had no year of jubilee to automatically free them, those who were under normal circumstances to be permanent bondsmen after they were purchased from their people to be slaves of the Israelites. So we see God giving these protective measures. This is to say, if there was any permanent damage or affliction done to that slave, something irreparable damaging, they automatically had to be let free. There was a measure of justice by God, a measure of justice for the slaves. Now you contrast this with American slavery that happened against the black people inflicted by Caucasians or Europeans of varied races. There was no justice. On your land, in your personal jurisdiction, you could do whatever you want with your slaves. You could even kill them and get away with it, never be prosecuted, nothing. Because whatever you said was the law of the land and they were your property, so in the laws in the south of this land, you could do whatever you wanted. That's not the case in the slavery of the scripture. Here you see God said if you killed a slave, then you had to be punished. And in Israelite law, it was life for life. Under the Mosaic law. And if a permanent injury or permanent scarring less than death occurred, then they had to be set free, says God. Now, why is that? Well, what shall we say about this? What shall we know? Well, number one, God is making clear distinction here that these are people, although they be permanent slaves under normal circumstances, although you purchase them by your money to be permanent bondsmen, although they are children of the foreigner, although they are not part of the covenant, they are not animals. The foreign slaves, the permanent bondsmen that you paid for, they are not animals. They are not equal with animals, but they are greater. They are human beings. We see God esteeming them. When a person, when God tells you that to, you take their life, you must be punished. If you permanently damage them or scar them, they must be set free. God is saying, these are people. I have called you to love thy neighbor as you love yourself, and not to oppress the foreigner and the stranger amongst you. These are not animals, for no law was given protecting the animals from their masters. Masters could do whatever they wanted with their animals, and the animals would have no recourse. But here, the permanent bondsmen, those who seem to be thrown under the bus in the permanent bondage by God, have recourse from God. And that is a far cry of a difference from the practice that we saw in American slavery afflicted by the Europeans against my people, African Americans. So do not liken the two to be the same at all.